It happened faster than anyone expected. One strike, one flight, and suddenly Nicolas Maduro was no longer in Venezuela. On January 3, the United States didn't just apply pressure. It crossed a line, a large-scale military operation, a sitting leader captured, flown out of his own country. Washington called it law enforcement. Critics called it regime change. The world called it dangerous because this wasn't only about Venezuela. It wasn't only about drugs. It was about something much bigger. Who gets to decide when sovereignty ends and power begins? I want you to pause here, not to choose sides, but to understand the system at work beneath the headlines. If you want clarity instead of noise, stay with me. Because what looks like a single arrest is actually the opening move of a far deeper confrontation. And to see where this truly leads, we need to step back and ask a harder question. What exactly was the United States trying to solve? That question takes us to the core of this story, and that's where we go next. What was the problem Washington said it was trying to fix? Officially, the answer was simple: drugs. Security? A narco-state poisoning the United States from the south. The Trump administration framed Venezuela not as a country, but as a criminal enterprise. A regime accused of running a cartel, a leader redefined as a narco-terrorist. Once that language is used, everything changes. Because if a government is no longer a government, then borders become optional, sovereignty becomes conditional, and military force becomes a tool of law enforcement. But here is where the story tightens. The scale of the response did not match the stated threat. Aircraft carriers against speedboats, bombers and drones against small trafficking vessels, 15,000 troops for a counter-narcotics mission. That mismatch matters because it suggests the objective was never only interdiction. It suggests a deeper calculation: pressure the regime, isolate the leader, and reshape the political outcome. To understand why this path was chosen, we have to look backward at how Venezuela reached this breaking point in the first place. That context changes everything. To understand why Venezuela became the stage for this confrontation, we have to rewind slowly, deliberately. Venezuela was not always a crisis. It was once one of Latin America's richest states. Oil wealth funded stability, influence, ambition. But oil can distort institutions. Easy money weakens accountability. Power concentrates. Checks erode. Over time, the system hardened. Politics fused with the security apparatus. Economic mismanagement met sanctions. Production collapsed. Inflation spiraled. Ordinary life became survival. As conditions worsened, the regime adapted not by reforming, but by fortifying. The military gained economic privileges. Armed civilian groups filled enforcement gaps. Loyalty became the currency of governance. Externally, pressure increased. Sanctions tightened. Diplomacy narrowed. Every move reinforced a siege mentality. This is the cycle that matters. Economic collapse strengthens coercive control. Coercive control invites external pressure. External pressure justifies further repression. By the time Washington escalated in 2025, Venezuela was no longer just a failing state. It was a locked system, difficult to change from within and costly to challenge from outside. That reality set the stage for what came next. Because once pressure fails, decision makers start looking for leverage. And leverage often appears as force. The first rupture came quietly, then all at once. Operation Southern Spear was introduced as routine, a counter-narco mission, air patrols, naval presence, nothing new on paper. But in practice, it was different. The United States began deploying overwhelming force into the Caribbean. Bombers, drones, amphibious assault ships, a Cold War scale buildup for a non-state threat. More than 20 lethal strikes followed, boats destroyed, targets eliminated, often without confirming who was on board. This was the moment the campaign crossed its first threshold. Because once a state declares itself in an armed conflict with cartels, it unlocks extraordinary powers. Lethal force without identification, war logic without war declarations, presidential discretion stretched to its limit. You could feel the escalation even before January 3. Sanctions tightened, oil tankers were seized, a naval blockade followed. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer about containment. It was about breaking the system. If you're trying to understand how modern power operates, this is the moment to pay attention, because what came next was not accidental. It was enabled, and that takes us beneath the surface to the machinery that made this possible. What made this escalation possible wasn't just military power. It was legal architecture. The administration reclassified the problem. Not crime, not insurgency, but a non-international armed conflict. That phrase sounds technical. It is anything but. Once you name a conflict this way, the president gains near total discretion. Combatants can be designated broadly. Lethal force becomes preemptive. Congress becomes reactive, not decisive. This is the hidden mechanism. War powers without war votes. Force without formal declarations, law enforcement, language, masking, battlefield rules. In theory, this framework targets cartels. In reality, it blurs the line between criminals and governments, between suspects and sovereign leaders. When a head of state is labeled a narco-terrorist, extraterritorial arrest becomes conceivable. Capture replaces negotiation. Extraction replaces diplomacy. This is how Maduro's seizure became legally thinkable, before it became operationally real. But systems like this always carry risk, because once boundaries dissolve, they don't easily return. And the cost of that ambiguity isn't abstract. It shows up next, in the moment power collides with uncertainty. The second crisis began the moment Maduro was gone, because removing a leader does not remove a system. It exposes it. Venezuela did not suddenly become governable. It became fragile. The regime's core remained intact. The military, the intelligence services, armed civilian groups, all still in place, all still armed. This is the paradox of force-driven change. The easier it is to decapitate leadership, the harder it is to control what follows. Opposition figures were abroad, unarmed, symbolically legitimate, yes. But legitimacy does not secure streets. Power, in practice, is physical. Who controls checkpoints? Who gives orders that are obeyed? Who prevents chaos? And here, uncertainty multiplied. Would commanders defect or consolidate? Would armed groups fragment or align? Would order hold or fracture? For Washington, this was the most dangerous moment. After the strike, before stability, history shows this window clearly. It is where unintended consequences live, where victories turn ambiguous, where intervention meets reality. This was no longer about Maduro. It was about whether force could translate into governance. And that question leads us directly to the people caught in between. If you are an ordinary Venezuelan, this is where the story stops being abstract. You don't experience geopolitics as strategy. You experience it as waiting, at checkpoints, in food lines, in silence when rumors spread faster than facts. Maduro is gone, but the men with guns are still there. You wake up not knowing who is in charge, not knowing which uniform matters today, not knowing whether order will hold or snap. Transitions are supposed to feel like hope, but uncertainty feels like fear. Banks hesitate. Shops close early. Families stay indoors. And here is the hardest truth. Democracy does not arrive by aircraft. It arrives when power on the street aligns with legitimacy at the top, when institutions, not personalities, take control, when force steps back instead of forward, that alignment is rare and it is fragile. If you care about Venezuela not as a headline, but as a human reality, this is the moment that matters most, because everything that follows depends on whether this window closes peacefully or violently. And to understand why the rest of the world is watching so closely, we need to widen the lens. What happens in Venezuela does not stay in Venezuela. The moment US forces crossed that line, every capital took note. Because this wasn't just a regional operation. It was a precedent. Latin America watched first. Some governments quietly cooperated. Others pulled back. Intelligence sharing paused. Base access became political. The region fractured not ideologically, but pragmatically. Each state calculated its own risk, its own exposure, its own distance from Washington. Then the signal traveled further. Russia reacted immediately. Emergency meetings, language of armed aggression, public reaffirmations of alliance, not because Venezuela is strategically central, but because norms are, if a sitting leader can be seized this way, the question spreads fast. Who's next? And under what justification? This is how localized actions reshape global behavior. They harden alliances, they accelerate militarization, they normalize force as policy. Markets feel it too. Energy flows, shipping routes, risk premiums rise not on ideology but uncertainty. This is the geopolitical echo effect. One operation, many consequences. And now the system faces its final test. What comes after the shock? That question forces us forward into the future. The future of Venezuela and the region hangs on three paths. First, the optimistic scenario. The opposition consolidates, institutions reassert themselves. The military accepts a lawful transition, oil production rebounds, normalcy returns. Here, force was the catalyst, not the dictator. Second, the middle path. Leadership changes, but chaos persists. Armed groups remain, supply chains are disrupted, Venezuela struggles to stabilize, and US influence is limited by on-the-ground realities. Hope exists, but is fragile. Finally, the pessimistic scenario. Power vacuums trigger conflict. Factions clash. The humanitarian crisis deepens. International intervention escalates. The region destabilizes, and what began as a counter-narcotics mission becomes a prolonged occupation. The lesson is systemic. Removing a leader does not remove a system. External power can provoke change, but it cannot guarantee order. Every action creates reaction. Every intervention carries risk. The next chapter of Venezuela will be written by decisions in Washington, Caracas, and beyond, and by the resilience or fragility of Venezuelans themselves. Understanding these scenarios is crucial, because what unfolds next will shape hemispheric stability for decades. So, what do we take away from all of this? Maduro is gone. The US made a dramatic statement, but the system remains complex, unstable, and resistant. This is not a story of heroes or villains. It is a story of power, law, and consequence, of how ambition meets reality, of how legality collides with force. The insight is clear. Force can remove leaders. Force cannot instantly remake a country. The threads of governance, legitimacy, and control are not easily rewoven. And here is the call to action. Watch closely, think critically, understand that the choices made today will ripple far beyond Venezuela. This is history in motion, and your understanding matters. Because when the next crisis hits, you will see patterns, you will see leverage points, and you will see where global power truly lies. Stay informed, stay engaged. The world is watching, and so should you.